There's a large number of birds and mammals that need tree hollows to breed in and to live in. But unfortunately our suburbs have shrinking tree canopy and there's very few of those really old trees with those natural hollows in them. This video will take you through the steps and techniques to make a log hollow at home. The main thing you need is the skills and experience and confidence in using a chainsaw and power tools. When considering materials to use, there's three important factors: sustainable, long-lasting, and good thermal properties. This is a traditional nest box made of plywood that I removed from a local reserve because I saw that it was missing a base and it was also missing a roof. So after being abandoned for a few years, all this was doing was presenting a risk to the public of when it would eventually fall down. There was no habitat value. The other issue with plywood is that the sheets can quite often be too thin and not provide the right thickness and insulation for successful breeding. So this would be a base material if you're going to do it. The next step up is using a reclaimed log and converting it into a hollow. It has good thick outer walls and has really good insulating properties. Of course, the best option is a natural hollow in an existing tree. So if you do have one of those at home, please look after it because they are the best habitat for our wildlife. Each species has different criteria and requirements. So I followed the BirdLife Australia technical sheet from their Birds in Backyard series. This model is aimed at eastern rosellas and I've used a wall thickness of 20 millimeters, the entrance diameter of 60 millimeters, and the internal depth cavity of 400 millimeters. When doing a project like this, it's really important to keep in mind risk and safety. If you're not confident with the tools or the techniques, then don't do it. And it's also important to use personal protective equipment when using these tools. I'm using a log that was salvaged from a eucalyptus tree, and it was cut down by a road authority and donated to the Knox Environment Society. Government agencies like local councils, Parks Victoria, the water and road authorities all need to cut down trees for safety and maintenance issues. If we can salvage some of these logs that may have created hollows in the future, and instead of turning them into wood chips, we create a log hollow and habitat, it's a much better outcome for our wildlife. With this log, I'm going to have the entrance on this side, and you can see that the roof has already been cut on an angle, and that allows the water to flow away from the entrance and prevents pooling on top, which will shorten the life of the hollow. Most of the work will be done at the base, and I'll be carving out the internal cavity from the bottom. So to do this, we need to start off by cutting a slice, a base plate, off the bottom of the hollow, and we'll be saving that for later and reattaching it at the end. I'm choosing 20 millimeters so that there's enough insulation to prevent cold coming up, and it'll have good thermal properties, and it'll be a solid base that doesn't rot out. we need to make a pilot hole on the base of the log to make it easier for the chainsaw bar to work its way in. I'll start off by measuring the width of the bar and just draw an approximate square on the base. And to create the hole, I'll be starting off with a flat-bladed auger and doing some initial circle cuts in that square, and then I'll clean up the rest of it with a 4-bladed auger, and these bits are approximately 28 millimeters. To then make it easier for the chainsaw bar to do the initial plunge cuts, I'll be using a long drill bit to cut all the way in as far as I can. I'll be using this drill bit later on when we're doing some attachment points. To prepare for carving out the center of the log, draw 2 guidelines around the outside of the base. The first is going to be for the outside wall, and I'm going to be using 20 millimeters thick from the edge. I'm excluding the bark because that will fall off over time. The second circle will be the guideline for the chainsaw, and it'll be about 10 millimeters from the outside line. That gives you some fat so that when you're doing your cuts down towards the wall, you're not going into it and making it thinner than you want or accidentally cutting a hole. At the end of the carving out of the center, it's very easy to do some much more gentle cuts to then remove some of that excess fat. To carve out the center, I've chosen 400 millimeters for the bird species that I'm targeting to carve out. That also matches the length of my chainsaw bar. So you can see that when I'm doing some cuts, it'll go right up to where the entrance is, and it'll leave some space at the top for those anchor points to be nice and solid. If you're choosing a different length, you can put a marker on your bar or use a longer bar. The technique that I'll be using is to do some initial plunge cuts and then downward slices towards that inner guideline. I'll then rotate the log and continue doing those cuts in and down to that inner guideline. At the end, I'll then do some more gentle cuts to get that fat between that inner guideline and the outer wall, but it doesn't have to be completely cleaned up. The inner wall needs to be rough so that the birds can claw onto the side and then climb out. If it's too smooth, they won't be able to climb out, and it's a bad scenario. When you're happy with the internal cavity and the thickness of the wall, it's time to add the entrance. I'm putting mine up just near this natural hollow that was starting to form, and that'll give something for the birds to chew on over time. Because the roof of the cavity won't be flat, it'll be more of a curve because of the chainsaw. It's best to measure it from the inside and then mark it on the outside. I'll be using a hole saw and then a chisel to cut out the initial hollow entrance. And not too deep, it's just to make sure that that initial cut is solid. Then I'll be using the auger piece to do more aggressive cuts internal to make that entrance way for them to easily progress from that initial entrance down into the main chamber. With the internal cavity work now complete, it's time to reattach the base plate to create the floor. Now unfortunately, my base plate, it turns out, had some internal rotting. So I'll continue to put this on for demonstration purposes, but afterwards I'll replace it with a solid piece of timber. And if you have other logs available, you can cut slices and then cut them into the right shape and then attach those in the same process. I'll be using 75mm and 100mm screws and putting them on different angles to the left and the right, so that over time, when water seeps in, they'll start to rot away, but they won't fall off as quick as what some of those traditional nest boxes will. They'll add a bit more tension to the wood and the screws. The final steps to make the log hollow are to put on the attachment points. And it's a really important step to use good quality materials and make sure you have a solid piece of wood up the top to reduce the risk of the log falling out of a tree over time. I'm using 10mm threaded rod with 2 eye nuts at the end. So I'll drill a single hole all the way through the top of the hollow, where there's going to be a substantial amount of solid wood above it. And then I'll cut down the threaded rod down to size and put on the second eye nut. In preparation for installing the hollow, grab some of the sawdust material from the carving process and put it back into the hollow so that the birds have something soft inside to nest on. This will replicate the soft, decomposed parts of a natural hollow, and the birds will bring in or pull out material as they need. To install these in trees, I've been using 3mm chain, and it might seem thick and heavy duty, but my aim is to reduce any risk that the attachment points will fail. So we need to make sure that this hollow will stay up in the tree for as long as possible. We need to be careful with live trees that the hollow doesn't rub too much through the bark layer and get to the sensitive parts of the trees. And we also need to make sure that if it's a live tree, that the attachment chain or other materials aren't cutting into any of the limbs. So I've been using small chopped up poly pipe from irrigation tubing. If you cut it into smaller pieces, then it's easier to maneuver around the chain. To attach the chain to the eye nut, I've been using a small D-shackle, like this. To determine how much chain you need, it's best to go up into the tree where you want to install it with a piece of rope. Put the rope around where you think the hollow will be, and use that measure to then measure how much chain you need and then cut it at the right point. When you're installing, you just replicate the same process with a D-shackle around on the other side. Depending on how you went with your hollow, you may need to add some finishing touches just to tidy it up a bit. If you've cut the side wall like this, you can use some triangle wood that's used for door edging, cut it down to size, and then just wedge it in. And this will prevent the outside weather from getting in. If you're not sure about cracking in the wood, or if you see some minor cracks and you want a bit more confidence, you can use some of this bracing to wrap it around and then just screw it in.